Every country on Earth is in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion, Japan owes $9 trillion, China owes $17 trillion, Australia owes $767 billion, even India has $736 billion debt. The entire planet owes $315 trillion, more than twice the size of the global economy. But here's the paradox that should terrify you. Every nation on Earth now lives inside this cage. They speak of debt as a burden, a number so large it becomes abstract. A terrifying paradox. If the entire world is drowning in red ink, who holds the wealth? Who is on the other side of this ledger? Then the four bankers came, for guys across centuries, designed a system where debt can never be repaid, where interest flows eternally upward, and where the people who designed the trap profit from every payment, every crisis, every bailout. The answer is the first bar of the cage. The world owes money to itself, to its own systems. When you follow the chain of big fishes, you discover something disturbing. This was not an accident. It was a design. A deliberate architecture constructed piece by piece over centuries. Think of a king. He needed gold for his wars. He would go to the wealthy, to the merchants, and he would beg. And if he lost or if he spent too freely, he would simply refuse to pay, calling defaulted. At least the debt would vanish. The slate is clean, breaking for the traitor and insulting for the king. It was messy, but it was finite. The system could reset. But then came the first architect. He saw a more elegant, more permanent solution. He approached a desperate king and offered a fortune, but with one condition. The king would never have to return the original gold. Not ever. Instead, he would pay a fee year after year forever. An eternal tribute for the one-time gift. The king, needing gold now, agreed on this. He traded a temporary problem for a permanent condition. This was the genesis, the birth of perpetual debt. The principal would never be repaid. It would become a permanent feature of the kingdom. The king's promise to pay was then transformed into paper notes that circulated as money. Debt itself became the new currency. This was the first and most profound bar of the cage. It redefined the very nature of obligation. It shifted debt from a temporary loan between two parties into a permanent, structural feature of power itself. The state was now tethered to an endless stream of payments, and the very money in people's pockets was a receipt for a loan that would never be called in. The system that commands the king. The invisible architecture that ensures his obedience through a perpetual, unpayable promise. Chapter 2: The Web. The first architect built a single, unbreakable chain. But a chain, however solid, can be seen. It can be challenged. It can, with immense effort, be shattered. The next evolution of the system was far more subtle and infinitely more resilient. It was not to forge a stronger lock, but to weave a web. In the beginning, sovereign debt was a direct line. A government borrowed from a discrete group of men. The relationship was clear, the risk contained. A default was a rupture between two parties. It was a failure, but a local one. Then came the weavers. A family with a vision to become gods of the money game. They established not a single bank, but a network, a nerve center in every financial capital of Europe. When a government came to them for funds, they provided immediately. But their genius was in what they did next. They did not simply hold the debt. They dissected it. They took the government's monumental promise and splintered it into 1,000 transferable pieces. These bonds were then sold off, scattered across continents to pension funds, insurance companies, and individual investors. A single national debt was now owned by a French retiree, a German factory, an Austrian bank. The direct line was replaced by a vast, intricate web. This changed the fundamental nature of default. It was no longer a refusal to pay a known creditor. It was an attack on the global financial system itself. To default was to rip the web, destroying the savings of countless unrelated people and institutions abroad. The consequences would be immediate, catastrophic, and international. The weavers, the spiders at the center, now held a power greater than any single king. They did not need to own the debt to control it. They managed its flow. They profited from every transaction. They had made the system so interconnected that its own survival depended on the perpetual motion of payments. The cage was now an ecosystem. And every creature inside, from the smallest saver to the largest nation, now had a vested interest in keeping the walls intact. The prisoners had become the guards. Chapter 3: The Illusion. After the web was spun and the world found itself tangled inside it, the game shifted into something quieter, slipperier, and far harder to see. This next phase wasn't about lending money or slicing bonds or even controlling governments directly. It was about shaping the atmosphere those governments breathed. The power players of this era didn't wear crowns or raise armies. They wore suits, issued statements, and spoke in the kind of slow, drowsy language that made people's eyes glaze over. That boredom was their camouflage. These were the central bankers, the priests of a new, bloodless religion built on inflation, interest rates, and the fragile psychology of markets. They realized something the architects before them had only hinted at. If you can control the cost of money, you control everyone who needs money, which is every government, every company, every citizen. So they created institutions that looked public but operated with private logic, independent bodies that claimed neutrality while quietly dictating the tempo of global life. They didn't need to own the world, they only needed to price it. Raise interest rates and businesses collapse like wet cardboard. Lower them and asset prices skyrocket, enriching anyone who already had a seat at the table. Print money and purchasing power evaporates from the pockets of ordinary people. Shrink the money supply and recession hits like winter. It was domination through dials and decimals, power without fingerprints. This became the third bar of the cage, the illusion of oversight. Governments pretended they supervised the banks. Banks pretended to prioritize citizens. And citizens pretended that money had some sacred, inherent value. Beneath all that polite fiction was a truth sharper than a knife. The people who control currency don't just influence the world, they define its rules, its boundaries, its possible futures. Nations no longer owed only debt. They owed belief. Belief that the system was stable, natural, eternal. Belief that it couldn't be challenged without bringing down civilization itself. And the wild part? The central bankers didn't command obedience through force. The world bowed because it feared the fallout of ignoring them. Their words moved markets. Their silence caused panic. Their hints, even their facial expressions, could shift billions. The cage wasn't physical anymore. It had dissolved into something ambient. A pressure everyone lived under without noticing, like humidity you only feel when you try to breathe deeper. The architects weren't done though. Everything up to this point, the chain, the web, the smoke, was only the prelude. There was one more evolution coming, the most radical one yet. A final transformation that wouldn't just control money, but reality itself. Chapter 4, the next phase. After the web was woven, debt was global, interconnected, and too dangerous to fail. But a web can still tremble. It can strain under its own weight. If a government borrowed too much, the market could still rebel. Lenders could grow fearful, interest rates could spike, and the entire delicate structure could shudder toward collapse. There was still a limit, a final check on the system. The third architect would remove it. His goal was not to create debt, nor simply to distribute it. His goal was to create an infinite, insatiable buyer for it. To build an engine that would perpetually demand more, ensuring the government could borrow without limit forever. The problem was a panic. A crisis of confidence where banks failed and credit vanished. One man, a banker of immense power, single-handedly orchestrated a bailout. He locked his rivals in a library and forced them to pledge their capital to stop the bleeding. It worked. But he was an old man. He knew this personal, feudal solution was not sustainable. The system needed a permanent fix. So, in secret, a small group of men gathered. They were the masters of the existing web. They traveled in private trains under false names to an isolated island. For 9 days, they designed a new heart for the financial body. They knew the public would never accept another central bank, an institution seen as a tool of tyrants and speculators. So they designed a masterpiece of deception. They would not call it a central bank. They would call it a reserve system. It would not be one entity but 12, seemingly scattered across the country to appear decentralized and democratic. It would have a board with government-appointed members, creating the illusion of public control. But the core machinery was designed for one purpose: to create money to buy government debt. The most powerful branch, the one that would control the levers of money creation, was placed in New York, in the hands of the very banks that had designed it. When this new system was born, the final piece of the cage clicked into place. Now, when the government needed to spend, it would issue bonds. And if ever there were not enough buyers, this new entity would simply create new money out of nothing and buy them. The demand for government debt became infinite. The need to ever balance the books, to ever live within its means, vanished from the state. The eternal engine began to hum. Debt was no longer just permanent, it was exponential. The government could always borrow more to pay the interest on what it already owed. The spiral could continue, upward and outward, without end. The third architect had replaced the gold standard with a standard of perpetual debt, and in doing so he built a machine that could run on nothing but promises forever. Chapter 5, the Masked King. The third architect's infinite engine risked creating debts so large that this escape hatch would become tempting. The final architect's role was to weld it shut. By the time the engine was running, governments had discovered something intoxicating. They no longer needed to tax their people to fund their ambitions. They could simply borrow. Spend now, smooth the consequences later. Wars, welfare, bailouts, stimulus, infrastructure, corruption, everything could be financed with a signature. No limits, no brakes, no honest accounting. But here's the twist that most citizens never catch. When a government stops relying on taxes and starts relying on debt, the people stop being its master. The bond market becomes the master. The lenders become the electorate that matters. The citizens become background noise. This is the birth of the masked king, a political system where elected leaders appear to rule, but the true power sits behind the cost of borrowing. Interest rates became the new vote. Market confidence became the new constitution. And the bankers, the ones who controlled the buying and selling of sovereign debt, became the shadow parliament no one voted for but everyone obeyed. At first, governments pretended they were still in control. They spoke grandly about budgets, deficits, responsibility. But behind closed doors, they watched the markets like nervous schoolchildren watching a strict teacher. One wrong move, one policy that spooked investors, and their borrowing costs would spike. A spike meant layoffs. A spike meant recession. A spike meant political suicide. So the illusion of democracy remained on the surface, while beneath it, a new hierarchy quietly hardened. Central banks set the tempo. Markets enforced it, governments complied, and the people endured whatever trickled down. But the real power shift came with the rise of what the fourth architect envisioned, the dominance of the dollar. Not a currency, a throne. After World War II, the US convinced the world to use its currency as the system's backbone. Oil, trade, global reserves, everything priced in dollars. This created a dynamic no empire in history ever enjoyed, the ability to borrow in your own currency from the entire planet. If America needed money, it printed dollars. If another country needed money, it begged for dollars. The dollar became oxygen. The entire global economy learned to breathe it. And America became the one country that could never drown in its own debt, because the rest of the world needed those dollars more than America needed discipline. This was the fourth bar of the cage, a single currency that ruled the world without ever declaring itself king. Countries didn't just compete anymore, they depended. And the dependency was total, to trade, to invest, to stabilize, to survive. If a nation wanted to escape the cage, it had to escape the dollar. But to escape the dollar was to sever itself from the global market. To rebel was to suffocate. This was the final, brutal innovation. The escape hatch was not just closed, it was replaced with a new, more intricate cage. In exchange for the rescue loans, the nation was forced to surrender its economic sovereignty. It had to cut its own spending, sell its national assets to foreign interests, and open its markets. The message was sent to every nation on earth: you are not allowed to fail. You are not permitted to default. You will take on new debt to service the old. You will transfer your wealth to your creditors in perpetuity, and you will hand over the keys to your economy in the process. The debt trap was now inescapable. It was no longer merely a financial mechanism, it was a tool of total control. The first architect made the chain. The second wove the web. The third built the infinite engine. But the fourth removed the very concept of escape. He made the cage not just a place you lived, but a reality you consented to forever. Hope you're enjoying this. This is kinda a special one for this channel. We talk about psychology, philosophy, and hierarchy. If you're interested in such videos, subscribe and we will meet again. And to support more, join the tribe with less than $1. Thanks for watching. Chapter 6. The Human Fuel. The architecture was complete. The chain, the web, the engine, the masked king, all forged into a perfect self-sustaining system. But a machine of this scale cannot run on abstractions. It requires fuel, a specific, relentless kind of energy. That fuel is us, our lives, our time, our silent consent. This is the deepest layer of the cage. It is no longer just out there, it has been internalized. It has become a psychological reality. We are not just living in the system, we are the system's battery. Think of how we measure a life now. From childhood, we are guided toward being a good credit risk. Our education is an investment. Our career is a path to servicing larger debts. A mortgage, a car loan, student debt. We are taught to see ourselves as individual corporations with assets and liabilities, constantly working to improve our balance sheet. Our worth is quantified by a number, a score that dictates the terms of our existence. They want us to fall in love. They want us to date fast and break up faster, just so the cash flow stays alive. That's why most dating apps promote adultery. They even stopped Tesla, you know the story. The perpetual motion of the debt machine requires a perpetual motion from us. We must keep producing. We must keep consuming. We must remain in a state of productive anxiety, always chasing, always earning, always paying. The endless flow of interest from the bottom to the top is mirrored by the endless flow of hours from our lives into the economy. We trade our time for currency, and that currency is immediately funneled back into servicing the layers of debt that form the very structure of our world. This is why the system feels so inescapable. It's not because the banks are too powerful. It's because we have all been enrolled as its junior accountants. We police ourselves. We feel shame at a bad credit score. We pride ourselves on a large salary. We see the pursuit of debt, a bigger house, a newer car, as the pursuit of success. We are chasing the very chains that bind us, mistaking them for laurels. The innovation of the modern era is not a financial instrument. It is the colonization of the human spirit. The cage has been so effectively built that its doors are now open, and yet we do not leave. We decorate ourselves. We measure their square footage. We compare them with our neighbors. The system no longer needs to threaten us with force. It simply offers us a newer, shinier chain, and we compete for the privilege of wearing it. The ultimate triumph of the architects is that we now build the cage for them, every day, with our ambitions, our fears, and our compliant hands. The interest is not just paid in money, it is paid in lifetimes. And this tension, invisible, everywhere, humming under every currency, every market, every paycheck, is the new battlefield. Chapter 7. The Algorithmic Shepherds. Here's the twist nobody wants to swallow. Once people became the fuel, the architects didn't need to tighten the cage anymore, they just needed to guide the herd. And that's where the new rulers entered the stage. Not kings, not bankers, but platforms. The architects of this era don't deal in gold or bonds. They deal in attention, prediction, and behavioral nudging at planetary scale. They discovered that if you can steer what billions of people see, fear, desire, and argue about, you don't need chains or laws. You can rewrite instinct itself. Every swipe is a confession. Every like is a breadcrumb. Every scroll is a tiny whisper about who you are and who you might become. The platforms collect it all, not because they care, but because the system needs more precise humans, more predictable workers, more programmable consumers. So the digital world became a mirror engineered to lie just enough to keep you moving. Outrage is profitable. Loneliness is profitable. Comparison is profitable. The feeds are not built to connect us. They're built to drain us, drip by drip, into markets we never see. And the wildest part? We curate our own cages voluntarily. We trade privacy for convenience, autonomy for dopamine, free time for the soft glow of endless scrolling. The architects don't need to enforce obedience. The algorithms do it for them, whispering through personalized chaos. The goal isn't to control your body, it's to colonize your choices. To make your desires align perfectly with what the system can profit from. Politics turned into content. Morality turned into branding. Community turned into engagement metrics. The world became a stage where everyone performs, but no one notices the invisible directors adjusting the lighting. The new power is subtle, ambient, and addictive. It doesn't need to punish you for disobedience, it just buries you under a flood of noise until you forget what freedom even looked like. This chapter isn't about the cage tightening. It's about the cage dissolving into the air, becoming the culture, the interface, the language itself. The architects have reached their cleanest victory. They no longer need to push us. We move exactly where they want on our own. Chapter 8. The Digital Shackles. The architects thought they had finished. 5 centuries of design, layer upon layer of control, culminating in a prison made of pure belief. The cage was invisible, self-sustaining, defended by its own captives. What more could be built? But evolution never stops, and neither did the architecture of control. By the early 21st century, a new generation of architects emerged. They didn't wear suits. They were kids in hoodies. They didn't speak in the drowsy language of banking. They spoke of disruption, innovation, freedom. They promised to break the cage. Instead, they built a new one inside it. The story begins with a ghost. In 2008, as the financial system nearly collapsed under the weight of its own complexity, as governments printed trillions to save the banks that had gambled away ordinary people's futures, someone, or something, named Satoshi Nakamoto published a paper. 9 pages that proposed a currency without banks, without governments, without the architects. A peer-to-peer system of money built on mathematics instead of trust. Bitcoin was born, and for a moment, it seemed like an escape hatch had appeared. Here was money that couldn't be printed at will, couldn't be seized by governments, couldn't be controlled by central banks. The cage finally had a crack in it. Millions rushed toward it. They bought Bitcoin and its countless children, Ethereum, Litecoin, thousands of digital tokens that promised liberation from the old system. They spoke of decentralization, of sovereignty, of freedom from fiat currency's endless inflation. But the sixth architect was already watching, and he understood something the early believers did not. You don't stop a revolution by fighting it. You co-opt it. You absorb it. You make it part of the cage. The first move was simple: let them play. Let the rebels build their crypto kingdoms, let them trade their digital coins, let them believe they've escaped. Meanwhile, quietly ensure that every on-ramp and off-ramp back to the real economy runs through controlled gates. Banks, exchanges, regulatory frameworks. If you want to turn your Bitcoin into groceries or rent money, you still have to come back through the system. The cage was permeable for a reason, so people could taste freedom without ever actually leaving. The second move was more sophisticated: surveillance architecture disguised as innovation. The old financial system was opaque. Banks kept secrets, transactions were private, money could move in shadows. But blockchain technology? Every transaction recorded forever on a public ledger. Immutable, traceable, transparent. The rebels thought they were building privacy. They were building the most sophisticated surveillance system ever created. Every wallet address, every transfer, every transaction permanently cataloged. With enough data analysis, authorities could track money with a precision that would make the old Swiss bankers weep with envy. The cage wasn't just rebuilt, it was upgraded with glass walls. The third move was the most audacious: steal the technology, discard the philosophy. Central banks around the world began developing their own digital currencies. They would have all the efficiency of crypto, all the speed of digital transactions, but with one crucial difference: they would be controlled by the same institutions that had controlled currency for centuries. Imagine money that the government could program. Money that expires if you don't spend it fast enough. Money that can be frozen with a keystroke if you fall out of favor. Money that tracks not just where you spend but what you buy, when, and why. Money that can be inflated or deflated at the individual level. Your digital wallet losing value while someone else's gains it, all controlled by algorithms and bureaucrats. This was the dream of ultimate control. Not just managing the money supply but managing every individual transaction. Not just setting interest rates but engineering behavior at the most granular level. The old system trapped nations. The new system would trap individuals. Each person their own cell, their own personalized cage with bars calibrated precisely to their spending history, social credit, and compliance record. The fourth move was already in motion: the financialization of everything that remained. In the old world, debt was borrowed money. In the new world, everything became debt, everything became financialized. Your attention was monetized and sold. Your data was packaged and traded. Your social connections became network value. Your future income was securitized through income share agreements. Even your time, the hours of your life, was carved up and sold in the gig economy, minute by minute, with algorithms determining your worth. The digital architects didn't just want to control money. They wanted to turn life itself into a financial instrument. Every moment, every choice, every relationship reduced to a transaction, each one flowing through their systems, each one generating a fee, a spread, a data point to be analyzed and exploited. And the cruelest innovation? They made it voluntary. Addictive even. The cage didn't need locks anymore. This was the sixth bar, and it was unlike all the others. A cage that migrated into the pocket, into the palm, into the very rhythm of daily life. A prison that felt like freedom because it delivered dopamine hits and infinite scroll. A system of control so intimate, so personalized, so gamified that people would pay subscription fees for the privilege of wearing their chains. The old architects built systems that took generations to normalize. The new architects built systems that felt normal from day one because they were wrapped in user-friendly interfaces and marketed as empowerment. The cage wasn't just invisible anymore. It was the thing people lined up at midnight to buy the newest version of. It was the thing they couldn't imagine living without. And the most brilliant trick? They sold it as the antidote to the old system. As liberation. As progress. As the future. The rebels thought they were escaping the banks. They were running toward a cage with better graphics. The digital shackles had arrived, and unlike the old iron ones, these shackles glowed, and people put them on willingly, eagerly, gratefully. Because the final evolution of the cage wasn't to trap people against their will. It was to make them beg for the key to lock themselves in. Chapter 9, The Clock in the Soul. And here's the bitter one. Money was always a form of manipulation, but at least it was a manipulation we understood. We could hustle around it, break rules, bend systems, cheat a little, save a little. Time. You can't counterfeit time. You can't print more of it. Whoever controls the clock controls the species. Money kept you on a leash you could sometimes slip. Time straps a GPS on your soul and calls it fair. There is a silence deeper than the absence of sound. It is the silence of a mechanism so perfectly integrated into life that its ticking becomes the rhythm of your own heart. We imagine dystopia as a boot on a neck, a loud and brutal tyranny. But the true architecture of control is silent. It doesn't demand, it doesn't force, it convinces you to comply. And the most perfect system would not control your money, your labor, or your speech. It would control your time. For centuries we have traded our time for currency. We sold our days for paper and digits. But this was a crude, inefficient system. The architects always knew this. The next, and perhaps final, refinement is not to pay you for your time, but to make time itself the currency. Imagine a world where your very lifespan is the ledger. Where every transaction is not a transfer of wealth, but a transfer of existence. You don't buy bread with coins, you buy it with minutes. You don't earn a salary, you earn days added to your account. This seems like science fiction, a distant nightmare, but look closer, the foundation is already here. Our attention is the new oil, meticulously extracted and sold. Our productivity is endlessly quantified. Our health metrics are tracked, our life expectancy calculated by algorithms. The leap from measuring time to monetizing it is not a technological one. It is a philosophical shift that an architect could engineer with a single change to the system's code. In this world, efficiency ceases to be a goal and becomes a matter of life and death. A poor decision doesn't just cost money, it costs a piece of your future. The pressure would rewire the human psyche from the ground up. The self would become a corporation with one asset, its own finite seconds. Let's talk about Elon's prophecy for a moment. The AI that works so we don't have to. It seems like paradise at first. But if you are not working, who is feeding your account? The answer is the architect. What is this if not petting, even if we don't call it by petting? The system itself becomes the sole generator of the time currency, distributing it not for labor, but for compliance. For data, for predictable behavior. You are paid to exist quietly, to consume peacefully, to be a well-behaved node in the network. It is the ultimate domestication. The treat is more life and the master is the clock. This is the final, silent bar of the cage. Money was a tool they held. Time is the essence of what you are. When that is commodified, there is no outside. There is no rebellion. There is only the slow, meticulous spending of a life that is no longer entirely your own. The tragedy is not that the clock is ticking down. The tragedy is that you didn't even hear it start. Subscribe for not trying to become a puppet and kindly visit the channel. Thanks for watching.